So, how about them Digimon? Yeah, today we're talking about Survive. We could have started with World Next Order or Cyber Sleuth since they have the most foothold in the zeitgeist of the most recent games, and we will get around to them as soon as I have an entire amount of my life to dedicate to the cause of capturing footage and cheat engine setups so I can counteract the inexplicable difficulty hikes respectively. Now, be not fooled. For this review would have come into being regardless of Storytime Stranger's announcement, but it did make me a happy canine, and because of it, perhaps this reaches you at a point where there is some relevance of Digimon as a property. But enough with the yap. Let's talk about Bandai Namco's visual novel tactical RPG, Digimon Survive. The game was originally being developed by Witchcraft, and boy howdy aren't we all. But after getting scrapped and rebooted, it ended up being made by Hyde. It was also published by everyone's favorite Tekken publisher, Bandai Namco. In ideal circumstances, the game was supposed to come out in 2019, but through a series of internal and external fucky-wuckies, it finally released in July of 2022 for the PS4, Switch, Xbone, and PC. The game follows a group of 6 kids on vacation: Akuma, or protagonist, Minoru, the loudmouth friend, Aoi, the group mom, Saki, the outgoing, Shuji, the wannabe leader, and Ryo, the scaredy cat recluse, joined by 2 locals, Kaito, who is protective of his sister to a sick degree, and Miu, who wishes her brother would stop bothering her, who investigate a local myth concerning the Kemonogami, or beast gods, which turn out to be more than myths. As it turns out, our group, now joined by Professor, a man with no name for most of the game, ended up in a world similar but different to our own, the digital world, and are not just any teenagers. They are the chosen kids to serve this story, a conclusion shocking to many in the audience, I know. Since they are the chosen, they soon come to find out that they have special bonds with some of the inhabitants of this world, and hilarity ensues. And by hilarity, I, of course, mean a slow breaking of their will to live as they spend more and more time either huddled up in decaying buildings or otherwise on the run from the powers that be, while they have to come to terms with their surroundings and the fact that the longer this goes on, the more their numbers dwindle, thus warranting the title of Survive. I shall dive into spoilers henceforth, so please, if you prefer to go into this blind, skip to the timecode shown on screen. Now that that's over, may I make note of the pacing it took us to reach here. What I have relayed to you thus far has been little more than the foundation we'll build upon, and the premise isn't that complicated. What if we tackle the idea of humans and Digimon coexisting, but this time there's actual stakes to it? That the Digimon don't become digital in their defeat, but just like the humans they may attack, they just fucking die. Yet to get to the first step of the game, it took me more than an hour to merely scale this foundation, when this should be the most natural step. Not to say there's anything wrong with setting the scene and world building, mind you, but there is a great deal of difference between setting the scene and repeating a single datum ad infinitum until we reach the next plot point, and sadly the game partakes quite heavily of the latter in the early game. I'm not usually one to really rag on narratives for falling short of being Shakespearean in their execution. I'm a fan of Kingdom Hearts, for God's sake. But it still needs to be said that there are a good couple of points at which the game drops the ball hard when it comes to its narrative, and the writing of characters in the first quarter or so. Which is not just disappointing, but doubly bad, as this is a visual novel. Failing to deliver on an interesting plot and on characters is the fastest and easiest way to ensure your failure in most cases in fiction, but to do it in this context is honestly befuddling. As some of the characters are not just merely barely elaborated upon tropes, but also may be written out of character for the simple purpose of fueling a conflict unearned. And so as to avoid complete hypocrisy in calling out a lack of elaboration while expunging details myself, the problem characters in my opinion are Shuji, Ryo, and Kaito, as well as Minoru in one arc near the middle/end of the game. The tie betwixt these characters, sans Minoru, who is but a sufferer of the symptoms of the writing of this game, is that all of them are antagonistic characters at various points that are used to demonstrate what happens to those unable to coexist with their Digimon. Ryo is too scared of the situation and their newfound guardian pet roommates to give them a chance, which eventually leads to him losing his sanity and succumbing to it. To say that he has a character arc is an overstatement. It is much more fitting a description to say that he has a character point that is stretched that way past the point of exploration, and goes nowhere unless you're down to play through the game twice, which, I'm gonna be real with y'all, I didn't do, because I just don't have enough time. Hell, according to PSN, only like some 7% of the players even finished the game once, so while some of these characters may be elaborated upon on a second playthrough, not only is the first playthrough itself something along the lines of 30 hours, but most players won't even finish the first 30 hours let alone the second go around, making Schrödinger's writing improvement irrelevant. To continue, Shuji is a step up from Ryo's quality by half a step, if even that. Instead of being the bare minimum to be called an entity written into a piece of fiction, he has an actual character to speak of, but alas, it is not more than the trope he is based on. Shuji is the stick in the mud overachiever looking for his father's approval. That is where he begins, where he ends, and his greatest inner conflict, which fuels his every decision. Which wouldn't necessarily be an instant loss. I mean, if he begins and ends in the exact same state, then he went through no character development, which would still render him a failure of character writing as one of the protagonists, but there's nothing inherently wrong with using this as a jump-off point for a character or using it as a character motivation. It is just a lack of development and the pacing of this lack of development that really sends him to the shit pits. His plan of survival is to hole up in the dilapidated school that serves us as a main base indefinitely until someone might show up and save us. Not a bad idea initially, it is the most logical method of going about things, but he stays attached to the idea that they are not only in the regular world but someone is also coming to save them way past what logic would dictate. His behavior towards Lopman as well is, or rather should be, a point of interest, because in this game's world, the Digimon, while still sort of remaining their own people, also serve as mirrors to their fated kids. Kunemon doesn't get to speak in a manner understandable to the humans in the same way Ryo's dialogue is chock full of empty lines that serve no purpose past making the player dislike them, whilst Lopman spends the game trying to appease Shuji to no avail amidst the latter's abuse both mental and physical, much like Shuji does to his father. And in the end, what this all leads to is the closest they can get to showing Shuji becoming a school shooter, not being able to go through with it, and committing suicide with this get up. Jeez, he took down such a huge enemy with a single blow? Yes, that's the way. Crush all the villains looking down on me. Oh no, run away! Huh? Why are you coming over here? Whoa, stop! It's me! Don't you recognize me? Stop! Wow. Only because of Shuji's lack of character development, instead of feeling pity, the player is left cheering that he is finally dead. He does not come as a troubled kid snapping under the pressure of societal and familial expectations and continuing the cycle of abuse, but as a cowardly control-freak silver spoon sort who has daddy issues and is more than happy to make it at the world's problem. Kaito, on the other hand, is beholden to a base that does him no favors. While you could make the joke that instead of his sanity, Ryo develops an Oedipus complex, and without further examination that may even seem sort of truthful, Kaito skirts the line on caring for his little sister and being attracted to her so close that the game points this out multiple times. As a side note, if you notice a glaring flaw in the writing that undermines a character to the point that it makes them unable to convey the message you wanted in your writing, pointing them out doesn't magically fix this issue. If anything, it is but an admission of guilt. This problem, compounded by the lack of character arc afforded to antagonistic characters, makes it hard to treat him at a base level as anything more than an incestuous weirdo, but the way the others treat him for the most part can inform us of the writer's intention, if the execution isn't there to speak of. Kaito is supposed to be overprotective of Mew, and once again, there's nothing wrong with that as a starting point. People can be overprotective of their loved ones without it being weird. What makes it weird in Kaito's case is that if we were to rate the intensity of his overprotectiveness on a scale from 1 to 10, he starts the game at 11 and ends it at 11.5 if you want to be favorable to the writers. Not only is Kaito's overprotectiveness called out in the earlier goings, but the latter parts of the game give us further context to his and Mew's past, early taking Kaito out of any sort of healthy overprotectiveness and plunging him straight into delusion even before the events of the game. And the thing that these three, as well as Minoru at one time, share is a complete lack of resolving themselves, to go along with their inability to have character arcs. Whether a member of this group will agree or oppose a proposition brought up by their circumstance is simply left to what is the most convenient for the writer's room at that moment in the story. Ryo doesn't want to explore the school's surroundings. Fair, but it definitely starts to be grating after the nth time you're going on an expedition and he's still doing the same thing. Once Ryo is out of the picture, Shuji takes up the spot of not wanting to leave. If memory serves, they justify this by saying he was shaken by what happened to Ryo, but it starts to feel contrived, and just like before, it takes no time for it to be an annoying part of every conversation that they're present for. Though it also needs to be said that by now, Kaito is also being an annoyance, and he and Shuji are at points seemingly in a race to be more insufferable. Once Shuji is out of the picture, we get Minoru questioning his fate in Falcomon, which is onset by Shuji's graceful exit, but otherwise feels out of left field. Although perhaps I make a mistake in singling out Minoru in this, because this part of the game includes most of the cast being suspicious of their digis, and it's out of character for all of them in ways that feel unnatural and make it seem like these plot points were only included to pad the runtime rather than actually making the characters face their reality. Then Kaito does Kaito things to wrap it up, but honestly, out of all of the heel turns, Kaito's solo act felt the most genuine and believable. Since he is a delusional or borderline incestuous weirdo, it seems less sudden for him to blame the group for what went down, and how he reacts makes sense in that context. That being said, however, while I'm aware of the trope of antagonistic characters redeeming themselves in death being somewhat prevalent, that bit of the game did feel unearned, when what happened was effectively him finally being allowed to hear the words the others are telling him, words that have been thrown at not just him, but the others as well to no prevail, as they have been given quite the obvious selective hearing by the writers, prompting him to jump on a sword and proclaim, "My bad fam." But so as to not just harp on the negatives of the writing, the game did still manage to surprise me with some of the choices they had made, as well as overall offering an enjoyable time when some bitch wasn't expositing in my ear about how they're secretly evil. From what I can tell, Ryo and Shuji are just fated to die on your first playthrough, but after them, it's up to your choices to decide who dies. Every time you make a dialogue choice in the proper context, nets you not just a change in your disposition, whether you are most wrathful, moral, or harmonious, but also grants you a chance to gain affinity with the other chosen. Reaching a certain affinity until certain plot developments may decide whether a character lives or dies. In my game, the unlucky sacrifice upon the altar of progress ended up being Miu, thus prompting Kaito's downfall. Help me. Don't worry, your queen is here to save you. Hey, Miu. Did you find them already? Yeah, over here, Kaito. Yeah, you found me alright. Huh? Is that an enemy? Is this a track? The creature in front of Miu turned into fog? Oh no, Kaito, Shakamon, neither of them can reach her in time. Oh shit. Kaito! And I have to say, by the time I got to this point in the game, I've gotten so used to the formula used for deaths, wherein a character starts uncharacteristically opposing the rest of the team, perhaps some background info is revealed about them in a vain effort, as the additional info only develops them laterally, and then they die to reassure us that this story has stakes, that the moment my previous choices caught up to me was swift and merciless to great effect. The lack of build-up to Miu's death, past putting us in a normal everyday combat scenario, really put the work in ensuring the player understands that unlike what they have been previously led to believe, death can and will be sudden when it needs to be. It is hard to put into words quite how much this and its contrast to the others really hit the mark without repetition, so as to avoid that, I'll just add one last time that the execution of it was quite remarkable. It nailed the sense of 1 second they're dead, the next they're gone, left me flabbergasted and in disbelief because we didn't do the whole song and dance, and further developed both Miu and Kaito, affording them what is more or less an arc of their own, making Kaito's regression from this point feel all the worse. We point out other remarkable bits within the story, while the other chosen, or supporting cast as Takuma, as well as their Digimon aren't quite the most interesting people on this whole wide earth, though it needs to be said neither are you, they still have moments where they get to shine. Saki almost undertakes the same filler arc that Minoru did, but handles things with more logic and comes out better on the other side. During a time skip we're not present for, Aoi becomes the group's leader and seemingly quite capable at that. Though sadly, this change is quickly reverted as soon as we're back in the driver's seat, and she once more becomes a little more than window dressing. Miu opens up a bit more to the group and really showcases that despite what her occasional demeanor may suggest, he does care about people, even her brother, and Kaito in response agrees to be more mindful of his sister's wishes instead of ignoring them for his zeal. Minoru is also there as your deuteragonist, and while I thought the arc itself was executed poorly, him wanting to live up to your accolades but being unable to until he overcomes his cowardice did make him a more interesting character. The Mons themselves sadly escape such movements for the most part, the only exceptions to this being Lapmon for being the most obvious to mirror aspect of their trainer, and Falcomon who more so feels like a yin to Minoru's yang, or vice versa, as in the aforementioned arc he deals with the sudden distrust by cutting himself off of the group, as he is distrustful of himself as well. Aside from these outliers, and honestly it would be more apt to describe these as outlying events, rather than to say that these two are special in their handling, the Mons are for the most part reduced to occasionally butting in with "I agree!" trainer name. And while I understand that juggling 8 main characters plus the 5 to 6 others such as the actual antagonists and supporting cast members properly is not only difficult but a test they have failed already, and that making the mons matter more would only double the number of protagonists from 8 to 16, making this even harder, the game is Digimon, for God's sake! One of the most interesting parts of the IP in comparison to some similar IPs like Pokemon is that unlike in those, the majority if not all of the monsters are supposed to be sapient, and that grants Digimon a possible dimension in character interaction that is not often afforded to things like Pokemon. Yet as it is, you could just remove some 80 or so % of the mon's dialogue and the game would still function mostly the same with minor revisions. However, at the very least your partner, Agumon, is afforded some moments of his own, which I enjoyed, even if he's oftentimes more of a prop than a full-on character.
Shut your freaking tap, iguana face.
My face is not an iguana! Sadly, the frequency of these little moments of his do fall off as the story progresses. Additionally, I found the professor and his many deaths to be quite the amusing decision to make for the story. And thus the professor died again. I hope this becomes a recurring theme that the professor shows up and then dies immediately. If he does that, I will love him. Perhaps not the best decision on their behalf, as the first time he died he hadn't been developed enough to make me particularly care about it, and by the final time, I had seen him die and come back enough times to make me question if this too is a fake out. To be fair, he did only die 3 times during the game, but in a story where death is the stake over decisions, a guy surviving things that should have killed him realistically speaking not once but twice is enough to remove the stakes from that character, if not the story altogether. Moving on to the gameplay, well, depending on your definition, there's not a lot of it. The game is a visual novel first, tactical RPG second, so most of the time is spent in narrative scenes developing the story and not playing Baby's first Fire Emblem. The gameplay that is there is quite shallow by modern standards of tactical RPGs. You have your regular movement as you'd imagine, your basic attack, and your spell equivalents in the mon's special abilities. These may have longer or shorter range, be detached from your character to a certain point, shown by the grid encompassing the entire area around your chosen mon instead of being in a line, just be heals and or buffs, or a mixture of the above. Along these, you of course have side and back attacks which deal increased damage, characters will have their strengths and weaknesses against certain elements, and items do in fact exist. There's 2 elements that sorta set the combat system apart from just the very basics though, 3 if you wanna be pedantic, I suppose. One is Digivolution, which is just called evolution in this game because Shinka does literally just mean evolution, but Benko can decide which one they're using either, and Digivolution does it to the IP and sets it apart from regular evolution, so as it is my preference, I shall refer to it as such henceforth. Digivolution allows you to move up your mon's evolutionary line for the remainder of the battle or de-digivolve them if need be for a little bit of MP. To reiterate something real quick for those of us who skip the spoilers, some dialogue choices will both raise your affinity with certain characters which will have repercussion on the story in the long run, but these choices will also affect your disposition, and whether you are most wrathful, moral, or harmonious will affect the evolutionary lines of not just Agumon but every main cast Digi, given your affinity with their partner is high enough to give them an arc. To further drive home the bond between the mons and their partners, in each combat you can have the trainers encourage their partners to give them temporary buffs to be used once an encounter. These can be things like better defense, offense, or greater movement. Considering their nature as simple, single-use buffs in an encounter, however, I wouldn't call this a great enough change to really set the game apart. Weekend conversations or not, they're just buffs under a different menu option. The other thing that sets the combat apart is the way in which you gather a team. While the partner Digimon are there for you to use in almost every fight, you can also enlist the aid of other Digimon encountered in free battles by engaging them in conversation and saying the right things once they've been weakened, which is very Shin Megami Tensei of this game. The team you grow through this might as well not exist as far as the story is concerned, and none of the mons held within are interactable in any way past combat and stats screens. That being said, these guys are still able to digivolve as needed be, though their digivolution works a tinge differently, as they don't evolve naturally since they lack a bond with you, but through evolution stones, and their transformations are permanent instead of only lasting a single encounter. Aside from combat, the gameplay can be roughly described as various flavors of menuing, from choosing where to be from a list to the actual in-game menus. There is however some more interactivity on zone maps, or the things that are between dialogue scenes and the map, where you can look around to a limited degree and find that there is not a whole lot of interactables in most screens. Sometimes the screens do possess secrets though, which you have to use your phone to reveal. These things can be secret encounters which in my experience was just a random chance for a free battle to spawn without picking that option on the map, or they can be items which you'll most likely end up hoarding in the lack of their need. To move on to the presentation, the game's soundtrack is kinda neither here nor there. It's fine enough that it doesn't ruin the atmosphere, but I'd be hard pressed to point out any songs or pieces that particularly perked my ear. On the voice acting front, the characters' voices fit. I can't really give a special shout out to anyone, as most of these characters have their moments to both be energetic and be understated, and they pulled off the range of things they need to do well enough. It does need to be noted though that the game is largely voice acted, but only in Japanese, which is fine on its own but did lead to some potential complications in my case, as I had recorded the playthrough and had to try to voice like 25 people all at once, but that's just a skill issue. I did get a halfway decent Agumon out of the deal, so it wasn't all bad though.
Give it to you, Takuma. I'm actually carrying multiple mech tanks.
For graphics, in my opinion, it's kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, the backgrounds are largely good or decently done, and the separate assets that might exist to liven up a scene while not always holding up to scrutiny up close due to compression still do their job well and fit into the world. The character's 2D art on the zone maps has a sort of Bandai Namco hired this man RTX on sort of look to them, but I liked it personally. It was very interesting to see how they handled the soft shading while still maintaining some bits of cel shading and not make all of these aspects clash. I have a bit more to complain about with the battle sprites, but that honestly for the most part begins and ends with them not having kept the same art style as the zones, which to be fair would have been a massive bitch to make look good while animated, especially with the raid animations they went with. The layered assets also sometimes had some trouble loading in, which wasn't enough of an issue to leave entire parts of the rig unrendered, but it was noticeable enough and happened frequently enough that I can somewhat confidently make the guess that the game uses pre-rigged animations for the combat, perhaps even more, where they have different sprite layers rigged up to a skeleton that they order to move. There's nothing wrong with all this, by the way, it's just not often that we can see this much behind the curtain. To go back to the combat models' art styles for a bit though, the reason I think I didn't quite like them compared to the dialogue scene models is that to me the art style is most reminiscent of those cheapo wide appeal art styles that corpos like to use, and to be fair, this game was supposed to be cheap, and they were probably told to make it look wildly appealing to maximize profits, even if those art styles tend to be the opposite of appealing to the majority. At least it's not corporate minimalism though. And if we're on the budget already, as series tradition dictates, Digimon Survive also comes with obvious tells of its lack of sufficient budget. This lack of budget, however, is thankfully mostly present in the localization, which still isn't ideal, but is still preferable to a lack of mechanical polish. The localization is fine for the most part. They didn't handle the word Bakemono and the digital monster Bakemon's name as the same thing, and at least in what I saw, they didn't split one line of dialogue into multiple options, thus making it impossible to tell what is being said. Then again, I'm not sure Bakemon's even in this game. The translation mishaps in this game were for the most part minor. One typo here. Give me life, for everyone's sake. What about me, boy? One word left out there.
Shakumon, why would he
Okay, I'm not being dumb right now.
Shakumon, why would he such awful things out of the blue like that?
Inconsistent pronouns rendering Celtic as gender fluid. I see, you've been through a lot, so this treatment would be understandable. She? Is that Renamon? Renamon? Does the professor know him? Renamon's a guy? You know, the huge. Rarely though, lines would have a misattributed speaker, which would usually only become obvious when a character would answer their own question in the tone of another. And at least once near the end of the game, there was even an entire dialogue sequence that was misplaced, or at least I'm pretty sure it was, as it made no sense in context. So overall, what did I think of Digimon Survive? Surely if I spent so long divulging its flaws, then I was miserable while playing it and loathed every second, right? Nah. Digimon Survive is a deeply flawed game. Not as much as some others I enjoy, and definitely not as much as it could be, but to the point where I wouldn't blame anyone for bouncing off of it due to these, and for the record, none of these flaws are that it's a visual novel. No, most of the problems it has stem from a lack of sufficient budget for the project, and the writing assuming that less than the bare minimum is sufficient for children's media since, you know, they're Digimon's primary audience. To reiterate, I didn't and don't expect some high-effort magnum opus from the narrative of this, but I don't believe my main point of comparison for quality, this being Digimon Ghost game, was too high a bar to pass considering they're in the same IP and came out close to each other. That being said, there's definitely moments where the only thing showing isn't just the uncapitalized on potential, but in fact cases where they do manage to pull it off. While a lot of our characters start off as a little more than cardboard cutouts of anime tropes, as the game progresses at least half of our products get fleshed out to a point that they become fairly enjoyable, and the game can even play around with their mortality to great effect. It's just a shame that the other half is sacrificed on the altar of artificial conflict, which, from some of the setups they didn't have to be artificial to begin with. If these characters were afforded character arcs instead of straight up flinching lateral lines as their progression, or in one case, getting this much needed character development only for it to be undone 2 scenes later, the game would have benefited greatly. And really, those 2 separate times I took 20 or so minutes to rant about just this during the playthrough notwithstanding, I did genuinely enjoy my time with Digimon Survive. The idea of putting more palpable stakes into a Digimon story was quite interesting, and even if it is lacking here and there, it is still the closest we've gotten to a game that successfully emulates the anime. But hey, let's hope Time Stranger's seemingly higher budget rings true and fixes some of the long-standing issues with the series.